Hey everyone, in this video we're going to be discussing about the London system and more specifically about the position that you see on the board. Because after yesterday's video, we started a pretty interesting discussion in the comment section whether e4 is a good move or not. And personally, in this position, I am preferring to just play queen e2 followed by the super standard rook to d1. But I came to the conclusion that actually going e4 it's still very viable and leading to some really interesting positions that we will be breaking down together. But before we do that, let's actually start from move one so that everyone knows how to get into these positions. There are obviously many move orders that I explain in great depth in the London system playlist, so we'll just go through it pretty quickly here. We're discussing about the positions where black goes for the Queen's Gambit decline setup. Basically, again, here we start with c5. It could also start with like e6, bishop d6, and then c5, or e6 and then c5. There are like many ways to get there. It's just you have to understand kind of the proper way to do so, but you can also just focus on the main tabia, which is after knight b2, d2, e6, c3, bishop d6, bishop g3. We get to this kind of universal position that I think everyone who is aware of the London system knows by heart. So here black goes castles, bishop to d3. And again, there are like many ways for black to play in this position. Queen e7 is a move. Rook e8 is a move with the idea to play e5. In that case, knight e5 is important to not allow it. But we will be breaking down the move b6 here, which is preparing to fianchetto with bishop to b7, and yeah, it's one of the most common moves really. So yeah, as I said, queen e2 is another alternative for white, but that's gonna be the topic of a different video. So here we will be focusing on this more aggressive move, going e4 directly, which is also like very interesting. And in this position, the really main move is just to keep the tension as black, go bishop to e7, because we are obviously threatening this super dirty fork. And yeah, Fury goes bishop to e7. There are like many games with this, a lot of strong players using this, Fabiano Caruana with black being one of them. Again, it's like the game is not that recent. I don't really consider the setup to be like one of the best that black can go for, but it's still something very common that a lot of people still do. But before we dive right into this bishop e7 move, I think especially for for lower rated games, or maybe I don't know, I would this is just like not a not an academical guess, but I would say maybe players that are around 2000 rating are very likely to take one e4 in this position, which, you know, it's also fairly natural. I think I might have done it myself if I don't know any theory. So yeah, let's just cover this. Black takes, we're gonna be taking with a knight. Bishop is hanging on d6. Taking on g3 is obviously great for us because we managed to activate this rook. And after knight takes on e4, we do take with a bishop. And now we have a threat over the c6 knight. And the discussion that we had on the channel, it was that after bishop to b7, white has this interesting queen a4 move, which is putting pressure on the knight, but it's connected with some other interesting ideas. So here black has many ways to deal with this threat over the c6 knight. He can move it away with knight a5, or he can either defend with queen c7 or rook c8. If knight a5, I think it's best to just take on c5, and the idea is that after bishop takes, we get to activate our rook with tempo, hitting the enemy queen. And I've actually seen quite a number of games with queen f6, which is just losing on the spot, and that is quite nice. And yeah, I've also seen people not winning here with white, which is kind of insane because it's like a +5 advantage. So let's see why. Here it's important to just go bishop e5. And after queen h6, if you go queen e7, then that's just lost after rook to d7. So queen h6 kind of has to be played, but then we can just take, and now queen e4 is a super strong move. And you can see that that knight on b7 is getting in a lot of trouble, as rook to b8 is not a legal move. I mean, it is, but it's just hanging because of the bishop on e5 that covers that square. I meant that one. So instead of queen f6, queen c8 is another is another move. And here there is this always kind of interesting idea that you can take and go for the Greek gift, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's the best in this position, as after knight g5, rook d8. Yes, this position is kind of interesting to play, but you are a piece down after all. I think the objective evaluation should be close to 0, which is kind of tough to explain honestly. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, if you're like really a Greek gift fan, I mean, you can go for this. But personally, I would just keep a slightly better position by playing short castle, and after bishop takes, queen c6. Here it's just best to keep queens on the board, and because of multiple ideas such as forking with b4 really important, or knight e5, activating the knight with tempo. White has a very solid edge, so knight a5 kind of bad for black, but so this line with the e4 is. Queen c7, another move and defending the knight, but we will be doing the same, take on c5, and not only just taking on c5 to bring rook d1, but also to open up queen's path to the king side. As you can see, after bc5, taking on h7 now becomes actually more interesting, as after king takes check, can go knight g5, and after rook e8, we can just castle long, and all of a sudden it's very tricky to defend black's position, because bishop on d6 is hanging, and for example the sort of normal bishop g3 is just simply lost after something like this. King can try to run away, but knight h7 is very precise with knight f6, and then we just mate on h8, and if black finds the better move, which is bishop e5 here, then we can just play rook d3, and we have ideas of checking on h7, rook lift to f3, with very decent compensation for the piece. Again, this is not like winning by force, but I feel like it's definitely having more chances to succeed than in the previous case. So after queen a4, rook c8 is another move for black to defend the knight, but then take on c5, go rook d1, hit the queen and castle, rook d8, and I kind of like the small move. Just play h3, make sure you have a luft, and you can then continue with like bishop b1 with the idea to set up the battery with queen c2, and just push on the king side, you know, just go for that mating attack, because there's no knight on f6, and usually when there's no knight on f6, you can do a lot of stuff against this king. So yeah, that would honestly be pretty much my take on this d4 move. I don't think it's particularly great. I think white is getting a very pleasant position if black does go for taking. Therefore bishop to e7 is way more trickier, and here we're going to be focusing in this video on e5, and after knight h5 we're going to be looking on knight to g5, which is not really a piece sacrifice, but the knight is hanging on g5 at the moment, so you can call it that way if you want. But before we get into the main line, I think to some people it might not look so trivial to go knight h5, you know, because you're placing your knight on the edge of the board, and you're also not really in love with the idea to take on g3, because that would activate white's rook. So I think for a lot of people it would actually be quite common to go knight to d7, but here it's important that you're familiar with this h4 idea, creating a big threat of bishop takes on h7. For example, if black goes for the pawn, takes on d4, we can just ignore it, take on h7, play knight g5, and yeah, it's just very dangerous position to play. Like king h6 is losing to bishop f4, and then knight e6 threats. If king g6, now we can play h5 with a winning position. So after knight g5, really the best defense is to go king to g6, but after queen c2, only move for black is really f5, and we can just take, and then knight f3, just a very cold-blooded move, and yeah, it's really tricky to just make any moves as black with a king on f6. Let's just give bishop a6 for the sake of the example. Now we can go h5, threatening queen g6, and after d3, queen a4. We're basically hitting everything, hitting the knight, hitting that bishop on a6, threatening queen f4 mate. It's just like completely winning for white. So after h4, black can also try to prevent us from sacrificing the bishop by playing h6, but then we can simply go short castle, and black can try a5. I think this is one of the best defensive tries, with the idea to go bishop a6, and you know, if black can actually swap those bishops, then it's gonna be much harder for white to create an attack on the king side. But we can actually play this very clever rook e1, which is a super nice prophylactical move, with the idea that after bishop a6, we can actually keep bishops on the board. And you see that this bishop is actually doing a great job in eyeing the enemy king side, while this one is kind of hitting the dust, basically. It's not really doing that much on a6. And another typical idea that we will be playing for is just trying to get knight f1, knight e3, and then knight to g4, with all kinds of sacrificial ideas like knight takes on h6. Yes, I think black might take the knight on f1 when we play it, but that's not really a problem, since it's gonna give us the bishop pair, and we can still like set up the battery. We have many interesting tries. So yeah, also in this case, after we forgot to mention that if black goes king g8, we can just go queen h5 with the typical checkmating pattern, that after f5 we go g6, take away this f7 square, and then queen h8 will be a mate. With that being said, we can focus on more of the mainline theory after knight to h5, and here there are many interesting moves, but what we're going to be focusing on, it's knight to g5, and this does not only attack on h7, but it's also opening up the queen's path, eyeing the h5 knight. So really, bishop takes on g5 as forced, and now we're going to be taking on h5. So in this position, after queen takes on h5, playing g6 is kind of the only move for black, as taking on d2 does not achieve much after king takes, and g6 dealing with the checkmate threat. But here it's actually very important to play queen h6, and the main issue for black is that taking on d4 fails after bishop to h4, hitting the queen, and then we are looking forward to play bishop to f6 with a checkmate on g7. So bishop takes on d2 looks tempting, but is actually just a bad move. So after queen takes on h5, g6 is really the only serious alternative that black has, but we can just drop our queen to e2, and yes, black can take on d4, winning a pawn, but white does get a very interesting play for it. And here the key move to continue the initiative is just to play h4. Again, taking on d2 would not be great, as we can take with a queen, and all positions after dc3, bc3. We're looking forward to push h5, queen joins via h6, with just huge pressure on the king side, and this bishop is never really gonna get into the game. So white just wins in this kind of scenarios, and after h4, it's important for black to keep the bishop by playing bishop to h6. And here again, we're just gonna be playing in gambit fashion. We don't touch the center, we just play h5, and black takes on c3. We have to recapture now because the knight is hanging, and this is really where you can kind of stop if you're trying to like memorize this variation. Like if you understand that you want to be playing h4, h5, and then just be getting in this position, then I think you can kind of be fine on your own. If you like get to this point. But I think it's important, if you really want to be playing this at higher levels, that you kind of know this by heart. I mean, there's really not much going on. Like, I think we played the London, and after b6, have to remember this e4 idea, and after bishop e7, just there you go, e5, knight h5, then you play knight g5, and it's all kind of forced. So I think it's just like one of those variations that is very easy to memorize, and that's like also very logical. So yeah, I think at this point, like, you're fine from a theoretical perspective, but we're gonna be looking on how the game could go, so we can get a little bit more familiar with the plans for both sides. And here after bc3, it's actually a critical moment for black, because taking on g6 is a big threat, and there are two main ways for black to handle this. The main one is to just play bishop to g7, but there are also some players that have tried going g5, which is not as silly as it looks, but I think white can get a pretty good advantage, especially in this case. So we're gonna be playing knight f3, and now black has to go f5. Otherwise, ideas such as knight h2 to g4 are just deadly. And after f5, I just like to take and then play castle. Again, taking on c3 would not really achieve much, since rook c1 will be slightly problematic. And after bishop to g7, I just like playing in the positional way, going bishop to b5, playing in some kind of a fringe defense, because the e5 square is pretty weak. And if black tries to go e5 himself, by the way, we're going to be following a game played by Aman Hambleton, which is going to be really impressive. I think he managed to find like a lot of very strong moves. And he played rook d1, hitting d5. Black replied with e4, attacking the knight. And now knight takes on g5 led to very interesting play. Black played knight e7. Idea is obviously, if you take the knight, then this one on c6 is going to be hanging. So knight e7 with the idea that now this knight is actually under attack. There are not many attractive squares to retreat, because knight h3 allows bishop takes, and therefore we have knight takes on e4. And after pawn takes, I was considering queen takes on e4. I think the engines are also fine with queen takes on e4, but the way he played it, it was actually like really spectacular. He played h6, hitting the bishop, and we have bishop takes on h6, and now rook to d6 was the point after bishop c4 check first. So king h8, rook to d6, and all of a sudden black does have a problem defending this bishop, because now after queen to g7, rook takes on h6 happened in the game, and the main idea is that after queen takes bishop e5, this king is about to get checkmated, and quite simply wins. Rook f6 can simply be met with queen e4 with a completely winning position. And after rook h6 in the game, black played bishop f5, but Aman played rook to d6, and white was just completely winning. So instead of going for this g5 move, which is a little bit overextended, I consider bishop g7 being the better move. And here we're going to be overprotecting the e5 pawn by playing knight f3. And despite the fact that in this position there were many moves tried, I find the bishop to b7 being the most natural one. And what is important to understand about this type of positions as white is that we will be no longer castling, as king f1 is just a very safe square for our king, and we want to keep our rook onto the h file in case we're going to be opening up that file, and we will be focusing to play for an attack. And rook c8 is again what I find to be the best move, keeping an eye on this pawn on c3. And here I think rook to d1 is the best move objectively, which is a novelty. It's of course given by the engines, and I will try to explain why in the following lines. Because bishop to h4 is what the very strong grandmaster Anton Demchenko played, but I feel like after queen c7, rook e1, d4, black is getting very decent play for you know, I mean, very decent counterplay. I was about to say very decent play for the pawn, but it's actually white who is down a pawn. So I just wanted to say that black is getting very decent chances for counterplay here after d4. Again, even though Demchenko ended up winning that game, I think the position was quite double-edged already, so I wouldn't necessarily go for it. Instead, after rook c8, I find the prophylactic rook d1 being a bit better, and this is my improvement over those games. And here black can play queen to c7, and this move is keeping an eye on the e5 pawn, but actually white gets a good position after taking on g6 and playing knight to d4. And all of a sudden the pawn on e5 is not really takeable, as bishop takes on e5 runs into queen e3, and after queen h6 we will be simply checkmating black. And also taking on e5 with a knight is not the greatest idea if we play the super precise rook h3. Again, this is given by the engine, kind of tough to really explain. Problem with knight f3 is that black has a good version of sacrificing the queen. After knight c5 with this threat of bishop a6, black will be able to collect this bishop and has very decent play for the queen. I think the position is around equal here on the engines, but yeah, I mean, I find it easier to play as black already. So after knight e5, is actually super precise to just play rook h3 with the idea to go knight f3 next, and yeah, white has a big advantage here. So after knight d4, the other idea would be to just take and go queen c3, hitting the d4 pawn. But again, I just really love white's positions with ideas to play queen h4. Then I'll just make like a few kind of wasting time as black here, just to prove the point. So here we're just gonna be trying to get something like this, get the bishop all the way to f6, and yeah, again, just showing a nice checkmate here. There are obviously many ways to do it, but this is just a nice construction that I want you to be aware of while playing this type of attacking games. So this is not really relevant what I've just showed, but just so you get a better understanding of how white will play the initiative. And even though, you know, we are down a pawn in the current position, that pawn deficit is not really felt, as white gets a very good initiative on the king side. So yeah, with that being said, I think we can just wrap this video up. And yeah, I think e4 is a very viable alternative in this position, even though I do still think that queen e2 is a little bit better, objectively speaking, combined with rook to d1. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you feel like you learned something, make sure to subscribe to the channel, and you'll get notified whenever I post new videos. And you know, if you're somehow looking for e4 courses as a London player, you can check out my Chessable page, and I'll see you there. Thanks for watching. Take care.